Hello, Bible readers. Genesis 22 is among the best known and theologically most demanding in the Abraham tradition. Walter Brueggemann claims that in many ways, the whole narrative, or this particular narrative, brings the whole Abrahamic tradition, starting in chapter 12, to its dramatic resolution. So far, we've become acquainted with a guy, Abraham, who's had some hiccups along the way as far as faith goes, but for the most part, this has been a man of faith, willing to relinquish his now in favor of trusting in God's promised future. The evidence of Abraham's faith is most obvious in chapter 12, when he's told to go, and he goes. His response to the promise in chapter 15, after God tells him to look up at the stars, and he believes, he trusts in God, and it's reckoned to him as righteousness. And then in his embrace of circumcision in chapter 17, all of that faith comes to fruition, we know, in chapter 21, when Isaac is born. And had the story ended there, we'd have a tale of origins, they would call it, as though the point of the whole tradition was to explain how Israel came to be. But the story does not end with the birth of Isaac. Genesis 22 shows that the Abrahamic tradition and all these narratives together, it's not primarily concerned with origins. It's primarily concerned with faith. Unexpected things happen here in chapter 22. Here we see that faith is a serious thing that's not just about laughter or lightheartedness. Here we see anguish as a part of faith. This is a tough story to interpret. And that difficulty starts with how hard it is to feel good about a God who commands a man to murder his own son. Like, what do we do with that? Brueggemann suggests that the entire narrative, this chapter 22 story, exists in order for us to hear verse 8. He makes his argument for the crucial importance of 22:8 by highlighting the structure of the first 12 verses. He does more of this, looking at structure to see what is the original author or editor trying to communicate. He does more of this than I've communicated in previous posts. But it's true that oftentimes the authors of biblical writings will clearly show what they're up to through the form they choose to use, or through the ways they may break form as a way to get our attention. Musicians do this by doing the same little da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. And when they do that little tit, that's the thing they're trying to get us to notice and hear. Brueggemann says this text is organized around 3 series of summon-response statements. For example, verse 1 says, God says, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am, and then God commands Abraham. In verse 7, Isaac summons his dad, Father, and the father says, here I am. And then in verse 11, an angel says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, here I am. I mean, Brueggemann is no rocket scientist for noticing the repetitious device here, right? But within the repetitions, there's a verse that sticks out. It's not sticking out like a sore thumb. It's sticking out like light in the darkness, or a warm spot in the midst of cold, or maybe I should say like faith in the midst of barrenness, right? Because that's what it is. Abraham, having been sent by God, about to build an altar, lay down wood, and bind his only son in order to sacrifice him, says in verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. These words from Abraham are the key to the whole thing, the whole story. In verse 1, we're told that God does all this to test Abraham. God wants to know how Abraham will respond. And by verse 12, we hear, now I know that you fear God. That's what God says to Abraham. So the story shows a movement, a progression within the relationship between Abraham and God. It's a movement from take your son to you have not withheld your son. It's a progression in understanding from God testing, wanting to know about how's Abraham going to respond, to knowing. All the movement, all the progress happens because of Abraham saying what he says in verse 8, which reveals 2 giant things. 1, God provides, and 2, Abraham trusts. Now, there's a whole other long conversation to have about God being a tester. This is the part that's tied grace-believing Christians like us into knots. I think this is a topic for a whole other study on its own, but I feel the need to say this. God is the tester at the beginning of this text. There's no getting around that. In the end, God is the provider. That is also true. Brueggemann says we must take care not to explain how this is, for it will not be explained. Without explanation, the text leads us to face the reality that God is God. That's what this narrative is all about, after all. Abraham's anguished acknowledgement that God is God. God will do what God chooses to do. No human reason or philosophy can comprehend these two marks of God, tester and provider. Faith is the readiness to answer to this strange contradiction in God. Faith says yes to the promise, which is no small matter. It also says yes to the command, which makes the promise only a promise. In the end, that God tests and provides is at the heart of a mystery about God that we are never going to figure out or completely understand. We don't have to, or even do we get to, choose between them. They're both true. In faith, we honor that both are true. That's the faith of Abraham. That's our faith too. Next time, we're going to get into chapter 23, 24, and then 25, 1 through 18, because that's how we finish up the Abraham narrative before we start looking at the big picture of the Jacob narrative. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.